Good evening and welcome. I'm Daren Wang, Executive Director of Air Serenbe, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to our virtual event. Um, this is hosted by the Atlanta History Center and Air Serenbe. Air Serenbe is a artist in residence program in idyllic Georgia countryside, about 30 miles southwest of Atlanta. We grant artists time and space away from their daily lives to focus on the work that matters to them. In other words, we were social distancing before social distancing was cool. Please look us up at airserenbe.com. I'd like to thank Kate Whitman of the Atlanta History Center for inviting us to be part of this evening. The Atlanta History Center is one of the more important cultural institutions in Atlanta. I hope you're all paying attention there. I'd also like to take a minute to encourage you to purchase a copy of Memorial Drive from Acapella Books. Their sales portal is linked on the webpage here. Amazon.com just set sales records last quarter. At the same time, I promise you that Acapella Books did not. Please, please, please buy your book tonight from Acapella. If you don't, at least use an independent bookstore. It's really important. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest of honor this evening. There are accomplishments that must be mentioned. Pulitzer Prize winner, former US Poet Laureate, Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. Her books include Belloc's Ophelia, Native Guard, Beyond Katrina, Thrall, and this new painful masterpiece, Memorial Drive. On a personal note, Natasha Trethewey has always been there for me right when I needed her, helping me through the earliest days of planning the Decatur Book Festival, writing a magnificent poem to celebrate its 10th year, encouraging and guiding me when I took up the pen to write myself, and now sharing her story and voice when we all need her most. Natasha, Decatur and Atlanta miss you. And we sent a little something your way. I think you have a package there from us. Can I get you to take it out and open it?
Yeah, I'm allowed to open it now, huh?
Yeah.
Here it is. Did you have to go steal this? Or, I mean, am I showing something that could get you in trouble, right?
So that is courtesy of the Georgia DOT. I have to admit that if State Representative Mary Margaret Oliver hadn't been able to procure that for me, I would in fact have been arrested climbing onto a signpost somewhere with a wrench.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have to do that. Thank you. That's really wonderful. Thank you.
But and finally, I am happy to introduce our interviewer tonight. Virginia Prescott is the Gracie Award-winning host of Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series and of GPB's On Second Thought, the very well-known radio show and podcast. And that's where you'll be able to hear excerpts from tonight's talk moving forward as well. I'm very pleased to say that Virginia is also a national advisor for Air Serenbe, so she's one of my best friends. Thank you so much for doing this, Virginia, and take it away.
It's my absolute pleasure, and that may be the fastest turnaround ever on a Georgia GDOT request, by the way, from transportation. So that's in honor of you, Natasha. This is a beautiful masterpiece, and I'm so thrilled to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I have to ask, how are you? You have been revisiting the story of your mother's murder every day, probably several times a day in some cases. How are you doing with all that?
It is right up there. The grief of it, it seems to wax and wane, but the process of both writing it and being talking about it every day is bringing it right up to the surface. Something weird is happening behind me.
I
It,
think you look as if you've been sainted.
anointed by the sun. That's right. um, should I try to change my angle?
Maybe changing your angle just slightly. Maybe move to the there. There you go. A little further, a little further, a little further. Right. The house is still looking good back there.
Oh goodness!
A little
But
further.
it's the sun is just really having its way with me
I
right
just
now.
had to adjust my blinds. Maybe you will as well, or you might have to change position altogether. I'm sorry, I
Wow.
can't see you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to change position altogether.
Okay. And while Natasha is changing her position, I do want to invite you all to submit your questions using the Q&A screen. It's a little icon on the bottom of your screen. It would be better if you use that than the chat, by the way, because I will be monitoring that much more closely. And you can ask questions, and I'll try to integrate your questions into the conversation as much as possible. Okay, looking good. All right. Well, it's just such a devastating book in so many ways. You were just 19 when your mother was murdered by her ex-husband. And after clearing out her apartment, you told yourself you'd never go back to Atlanta, let alone Memorial Drive, the scene of the crime. But you did. You returned to teach at Emory, and now, 35 years later, publishing this book. So what is it that brought you back?
Um, Brought me back to Atlanta or
Yeah.
to,
To that
yeah.
scene, to that whole story that you were trying to erase on some level.
Well, I think they're connected because I came back to Atlanta to accept a great job at Emory, where I worked for 16 years. And in some ways, I think I might not have um, written this book if I hadn't come back, if I hadn't placed myself in the proximity of this past that I was trying so hard to forget.
This is a personal history, private history, but really connected to American history in so many ways. You were born to a Black mother and a white father. This was in Mississippi, significantly on April 26, 1966, so the 100th anniversary of Confederate Memorial Day.
Right.
You lived with your mother's extended family in Gulfport, Mississippi, which sounds like a pretty idyllic childhood, just surrounded by love and comfort. So
Mm-hmm.
when did you first become aware of the hostility towards your mixed race parents?
Pretty early on. I can remember going places with my parents in Mississippi and, having people stare at us, glare at us, um, follow us out of stores, say nasty things. I must have been probably as early as 3 or 4 years old when I first encountered it and was conscious that it was happening.
And your mother was an early, let's say, devotee of the civil rights movement. She did a wade-in as protest.
That was my grandmother, but
Oh,
yes.
grandmother, I'm sorry.
And my grandmother was dragging my mother into it as a teenager. Mm-hmm.
But she also had a Klan, the Klan burned a cross on her front lawn. You were too young to remember that, but can you first tell us why she was targeted?
Well, my grandmother's house where we were living at the time was right across from the Mount Olive Baptist Church. And at that time, the church had been doing a voter registration drive to get disenfranchised African Americans registered to vote. My grandmother had participated, helping. She'd also given shelter to white Mennonites who were in the community to minister and to build a community center. Her driveway is where the cross was burned. And because the church didn't have its own driveway, she would let them park the church bus in her driveway. So we were never quite sure if the cross burning was simply about the civil rights activity, the voter registration that she was participating in and the church was doing, or because of the interracial family that was living inside the house.
Right. But that power, which I think is power, is such a big subtext in this book and comes over gender power, racial power, all kinds of different power, violence in some kind of way. And you were too young to remember when this cross was burned. But the power of story is also a big part of this book. And this story was told and retold in your grandmother's house. Well, what did that affect? What was the effect on you of hearing that story?
Well, I think it was one of the many, sort of like a cautionary tale. It was something that was important to know, to be aware of the possibilities of danger, and that awareness could make us safer rather than not knowing.
Mm-hmm. Got a question here from Tess. Says, hello, thank you for sharing your time this evening. Do you have plans to write more memoir?
You know, what I most want to get back to is writing some poems next, but I have thought often that there are parts of the story of my relationship, my long relationship with my father, that bear writing about, because obviously this is a story that includes him in parts, but it's not the story I was telling in this book. He was also a big, lovely, wonderful personality who probably deserves his own book.
And also a poet. And I think a lot of people, you read together on occasion. I think a lot of people may think that he was the reason that you became a writer and a poet. But we find out in this book that your exploration brings you to different conclusions. And it was actually this exploration of your mother that made you a writer. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, I mean, certainly my father encouraged me to go to graduate school. He's been encouraging me since I was a small child by telling me that because of my particular situation, growing up Black and biracial in Mississippi, that I would have something important to say. But it was the existential wound of losing my mother that really hurt me into poetry. When I think about the two things that probably hurt me, one of them has everything to do with being in Mississippi, being born to a place like that, when my parents' marriage was illegal, when I was rendered illegitimate in the eyes of the law, sort of the way that in W.H. Auden's memorial to William Butler Yeats, he writes, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Mad Mississippi did some of that too. And that's the kind of poetry I wrote as a child. But it was the deeper wound of losing my mother that really made me a poet, needing to try to contend with that grief that seemed insurmountable and the need to find a container that could hold it. Now, there's a beautiful poem by Liesl Mueller about when her own mother died. It's a poem called When I'm Asked, and it begins, when I'm asked how I began writing poetry, I talk about the indifference of nature. The poem goes on to describe how beautiful the day was in June, and nothing seemed to be weeping, nothing seemed to be reflecting her grief. And in the end, she writes, "So I put my grief in the mouth of language, the only thing that would grieve with me." That's what poetry became for me.
Well, and the language in this book is beautiful. You know, it's poetic. It is also sort of creating this image of your mother, and we begin to see only later in the book her speaking in her own voice. But I want to talk about a little bit earlier when you were just 7 years old, when you left this comfort, the attention of your adoring relatives in Mississippi to move to Atlanta. So this was 1973, you know, Atlanta kind of announcing itself as the capital of the New South.
Mm-hmm.
your mom, she was waiting tables at Atlanta Underground, which a lot of people will remember. And she was putting herself through school, and she went on to get her master's in social work. So this is a portrait of a very determined and gutsy woman. I just want to make sure we have a real sense of how you think of your mother before we move on.
Yes, indeed. She was smart and resilient and, gutsy in all the ways that you suggest, including trying to take back her life from someone who abused her for nearly 10 years. I think the toughest thing she had to do, and I think perhaps people don't realize this, is to find a way to get out. And my mother was a social worker. She had a master's in social work. She was well connected. She had friends. She wasn't dependent on her abuser for her livelihood or for the care of her children or for shelter. She did all the things right. She did all the things that we tell women in those situations to do to get out. And still, she couldn't escape. The statistics suggest that your chances of dying go up when you try to leave rather than when you stay. So she did that knowing what the outcome could be. That's tough. That's resilient.
When did you first begin to see signs that she was being abused?
I first heard the abuse when I was in the 5th grade. We had moved to a new house, and my room was down the hall, and my brother's room was right next to theirs. And he was very small and still afraid to sleep in his new room by himself. So on some nights I would go and sleep in the bunk bed to be with him until he fell asleep. And on one of those nights I heard it.
You write about that part of that when your realization, these lost years, in the second person, when you're recounting how Joe, Big Joe, her husband, the man known as Big Joe, psychologically tormented you when your mother wasn't around, observing yourself as you're it's like a character in a story. And I wondered what was behind that decision and that voice.
Well, two things. On the one hand, there is the way that a feeling of trauma can fragment the self, can make you wish that you were someone else and not the person to whom these things were happening. As an issue of writing, as an issue of craft, I wanted to show that. I wanted to show the way that trauma can divide the self. Because it became important to also show how what happens in the next chapter, the way that fragmented self is collected, is gathered, is composed through the possibility of writing, of telling a story. It was also very much an attempt to illustrate just how much I have tried to erase and banish all of those years, such that even now I could see that person as someone other than me. And I try to set that imagery up in the very beginning of the book, in the prologue, when I write about seeing a news story in which the video shows me arriving and going up and walking into the apartment the morning after my mother's death. The two-ness of that, feeling divided as the person watching oneself.
Right, you right. That's where it begins. Our estrangement, yourself from your young self. This this act of separation, which feels like, it reads to me like an act of survival. That this girl that's carrying all that pain, you want to be as distant from her as possible.
Mhm.
I wonder if you think your mother might have been doing that too, separating from herself. I don't know if that's too much of a projection, but I wondered if you have thoughts on that.
It's an interesting question because, I write about um, her zodiac sign, which is the Gemini, the twins. I write about the Janus mask that she had that represents in drama, comedy, and tragedy, those two faces. And I talk about the way that she was able to show most always that laughing face to me, but perhaps hiding the face of tragedy, the face that was enduring what she was enduring.
Well, you never told her that he threatened to kick you out when you were driving on the highway, or psychologically abusing you or following you. So you, in some ways, were presenting the hiding the face of tragedy, and she never told you that he was beating her. So you both kept this silences, and I couldn't help but think, reading this, of Audre Lorde writing, "Your silence will not protect you." Did you think that way was a way of protecting her from your pain?
I think I did think that at first. I thought that, before I really knew what was happening to her, I thought if I kept that, I was being a good child. And then afterwards, even when I knew, um, it still it still baffles me why I waited until that moment that she and I walked hand in hand up the street together um, in my senior year of high school, when it all came out in a rush. Um, but something I had a conversation with someone else recently about abusers and how they somehow don't even have to tell you not to tell.
That is the power, right? The thrall in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, you found it in documents later. By her account, she'd had blackened eyes, fractured jaw, bruised kidneys, sprained ankle. She lost all this weight. The physical and emotional toll were really showing on her in a much different way. And also found in case documents that he had planned to kill you. This was after you had that talk walking down the street with your mother and unloaded to her what had been really happening. And she had been making her own plans to find a get out of the house. So, can you tell us what you learned about his plan to kill you?
Yes, it was the week that we left, that we escaped, and my mother went to a shelter for battered women with my brother, and I went to stay with friends from school. And so he couldn't find her in the shelter, but he knew where I would be at the high school football game, down on the track with the rest of the cheerleaders. And so um, his plan was to come to the game and to kill me, to punish her. He didn't, he later told a psychologist, because I smiled and waved at him.
I can only imagine, as you write in the book, about the thought that had he killed you then, he would be in prison and your mother would be saved.
Mm-hmm.
That there must be so much associated with that, which, as we find in the book, is really a sort of a key to so many different things.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at that now that you've written it down, now that you've articulated it, said those things out loud that you might have been carrying?
Well, it helped me to learn that indeed I had been carrying in my body this sense of survivor's guilt. In one of the last chapters of the book, I quote Faulkner, memory knows before knowing remembers. It's the way that somehow in the body, I carried that knowledge of having inadvertently saved myself. I think that's why that image enters into the dream I had just a few weeks after her death.
Can you tell us a little bit about that dream?
How about if I read from that? I can just read the dream. It's a short passage that opens the book. "3 weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense of contentment, as if she's only gone someplace else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which, now, a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun. Her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I'm not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout, no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains, her last question to me. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain. I dreamed that just a few weeks after her death, and I thought about it over these last 35 years. And it took me a long time into writing this before I began to make sense of that scene, that track, that oval track that she and I are walking around, where we meet him, where he's aiming the gun. Because when he came down to the football stadium, I was down on a track. And when he looked at me, I waved and spoke a greeting. I said, "Hey, Big Joe." And that's what he told the psychologist that kept him from shooting me right then. And so I had that dream, but I didn't understand somehow that memory knew before knowing remembered. And it took the remembering of writing this to understand that I've carried this since then.
That little gesture, showing some sense of kindness to somebody, it's so powerful and so devastating to think about. But it also, when you were reading that now, after having read it in the book, it reminded me of you talking as a child. Your father, you read a lot of classical mythology and those cautionary tales and myths and those lessons. Your father, I think he called you Cassandra in some of them, right? Or referred to you as Cassandra, the prophet who nobody believes. And I think in the mind of a child, this idea that you can make things happen or not happen, how does that evolve when you have been living so long with a situation that you wanted to prevent with everything that you had but could not, or were powerless over?
Well, I mean, I still think that I have a part of me that is a magical thinker. And it starts in the kind of magical thinking of childhood. And it can continue. I think trauma locks it in some ways. So even as my rational mind knows that I can't control things, that I'm not setting things into motion by thinking of them, I have still little talismanic things I say to myself when I think something to banish it, because there's still the part of me that thinks, oh, if I say this, if I think this, like Cassandra, it will happen.
There's another thing that you excavate, another document from the court case. It's this transcript of a phone call that your mother has with Joel, the man who ends up murdering her. He's just gotten out of prison for attempting to murder her. She's been recording calls on the advice of a DA from DeKalb County as evidence of threats for police protection. And it is just harrowing to read how she's trying to reason with him as he says he's going to kill her if she doesn't reconcile with him. First of all, how you even found these documents is astounding and makes me think of, a little bit of kismet or magical thinking, or you were meant to in this kind of path.
Right.
That story is so amazing. Right in downtown Decatur.
Mm-hmm. So much feels like a serendipity or, destiny, what is written in one's stars. But just walking from home into downtown Decatur one day, and a man saw us and approached us, my husband and I, in the restaurant that we'd gone into. And he came up to me and he said, "Did I just see you two walking from the hotel?" And because we were coming from home, I said no, even as we would have passed the hotel on our way from home. And so he said, "Oh, I'm sorry to bother you." And he went and sat back down. And then he sent over a round of drinks and said, and the bartender said, Bob said to say, "Sorry for bothering you guys." And I thought, well, that's really odd. And so I thought I should just go over and thank him and introduce myself. And it was that changed everything. I went over and I had a conversation of pleasantries, what do you do? And then he asked me if Gwen Grimmett was my mother and Joey my brother. And he hung his head and began to weep. And I looked over at his wife and she said, "Not a day passes that he doesn't think about your mother." He had been the first police officer on the scene back then and is now an assistant district attorney in Rockdale County. And so he told me that after 20 years, they purged the records. And so he got them for me so that I would have them.
What was it like? I mean, I'm sure you had to read this over and over again. And did you listen to the cassette of her actually on the phone?
No, just the transcripts.
Which is devastating enough as it is. But for you, after this, the rest of the book, there's such impressionistic, through your vision, this sense of your mother that we get. And then we get this very factual, almost forensic kind of evidence. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that decision to put that in the book, because I'm guessing that there was some debate for that, for you.
That was a very hard decision to make because on the one hand, you think when you're writing a memoir that you're supposed to be telling the whole story, and that I'm always interested, even as a poet, in documentary evidence. I make use of it all the time. And I thought that there might be readers who wondered why I wasn't telling the story as opposed to letting the documentary evidence tell the story. And I thought about how I could tell you how wonderful and resilient and smart and stoic and patient my mother was. And you might just think, well, that's just a daughter who would make a heroine of her mother and say that anyway. I needed you to see it. I needed you to hear it in her own voice, in her own words. Because I think the facts are incontrovertible. You see just how much she had to do to try to save her life. And you hear her voice in ways that I could not ventriloquize. I wanted you to hear her.
It is one of the very powerful things about this book. In fact, I've got a note here. Tina, hello, Natasha. So good to see you again. The last time we met, you were on your way to really dig into this deep, rich work. Brava. How does it feel to have this out there in the world? As we said, you've had to talk about it over and over again, but now that it's there.
God, I was just thinking of some quote from some famous writer, and I can't exactly remember it, but he was asked if he liked writing a particular book of his, and he said, "No, I like having written it." I feel like that. I did not like writing it. It was very difficult to go into those places that I've spent most of my life trying to bury and suppress. But I feel so happy to have written it. Mainly because for me, it is an attempt to create a lasting monument for my mother. Something more lasting even than stone. And to think that so many people are reading it or getting to know her in this way makes me feel really happy.
Well, I am happy to know her through this book. Such an amazing woman, and you really do hear it in that phone call that she is, fighting for her life on some level. And that leads to a question. There was an officer after that phone call documenting his threats. He said, "I will kill you." And she said, "What about my children?" He said, "They'll get over it eventually." I'm summarizing, but there was just such coldness and such manipulation on his part, or attempted manipulation on his part. But there was an officer assigned to the complex who left hours before he was supposed to, and that was when she was murdered, in those intervening hours. And we're reading this at a time when there are big questions being asked about policing, especially given the history of police and African Americans. So looking at that, did the system fail your mother?
Oh, I think, the system failed my mother in so many ways, but it doesn't start there. The system that failed my mother is a nation that turns a deaf ear to domestic violence, to a society who thinks domestic violence only happens to certain kinds of people, perhaps people who have some character flaw, that brings this to them. A society who often says to women, "You made your bed, now lie in it." A society that did not, in our nation's capital, when Congress voted to reinstate the Violence Against Women Act, there were people who voted against it. When the first time he tried to kill her, and he was found not guilty of attempted murder, there was a juror who lived in our apartment complex who said, "Well, I think it's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves. But the next time he's in the apartment complex, I'm going to shoot him myself." She's failed by every news report or police report that continued to call her his wife when they were divorced. She was his ex-wife. And yet, this idea that somehow his claim to her was ongoing. The system that failed her is so much larger than that one moment.
I want to look at more the systemic racism, because this is a big backdrop of this, the fact that she was murdered within the shadow of Stone Mountain, the largest monument to the lost cause, the white supremacist monument in the United States. And there's a related question here to that heritage. You know, you have done this exploration of your own history, and I'm curious about how you counter that question that people say, you can't erase history. This is our heritage. And Eric asks here.
Wait a minute.
Yes,
Let me just say something right now.
Yes, please.
That monument already erases history. Let's just say, I'm not trying to erase it. It was already erased. If the true history of the victory of our nation were inscribed on the landscape, see, this monument is to the traitors, the people who fought to preserve slavery, who fought to destroy the Union, as opposed to the nearly 200,000 African Americans, native sons from the South who fought for the Union in the Civil War to support and protect the Union, to fight for their own freedom and to push this nation a little closer to its founding ideals. If we had monuments all across the South to the victors, to the preservation of the Union, that would be history, as opposed to having erased that by only having monuments to white supremacy.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think there's a related question here of from Eric, who says that he's also a native Mississippian, who understands how a state can make a crime of a person, reducing many to second-class citizenship. So what are your thoughts on the changing Mississippi flag? You write so powerfully about it in South. Are you hopeful that any movement has occurred?
Well, I wrote.
I'm sorry, I should correct that. Are you hopeful that some movement has occurred?
Oh, yeah. I wrote a piece for the New York Times when the state of Mississippi finally decided to get rid of it. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. It's pretty remarkable. I think that as a symbolic gesture, it is one of the ways that we begin to move the needle. It is one of the ways that we begin to say, we're not going to have a flag that is a constant reminder and messaging to some of our citizens to stay in their place. Instead, we might fly a flag that represents all Mississippians.
Cynthia asks, why did you decide to tell this story in memoir rather than through poems?
Well, because there were just some things that I felt needed a little bit more space to examine than poems. There are poems in my most recent book of poems, Monument. It's a new and selected. And while I was working on this memoir, sometimes I would have to turn the page over and write a poem, because some of it came out in poems, some of it came out in prose. But even as this is a 200 and some page prose narrative, I wrote it as if I were writing a long poem or a long sequence of poems, an entire collection.
So I want to get back to this idea that you connected this self, after your mother was murdered, you saw yourself on film, you separated yourself from that self, and this amnesia that you've been exploring as a writer and your calling as a writer. I would just love to have you elaborate a little bit more on connecting those two, because you write in the book about this concept of duende, well, I will let you explain it rather than I.
Well, so what Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, was talking about in Duende is the difference between an artist who is simply able to make beauty, And that's a wonderful thing, to make beauty. But without the demon, he calls it, that drives an artist towards something else, something that incarnates an awareness of death. Without that, it will be merely beautiful and not perhaps transcendent in necessary ways. He writes, in trying to heal the wound that never heals lies the strangeness. It is that deep wounding that allows us to make something beyond simply beautiful. I connected even to Rumi's idea, the wound is the place where the light enters you. So it's that woundedness that allows a writer, an artist, to move beyond simple beauty. And that's why it was so strange to have that appear in that earliest dream right after my mother's death, because I know I hadn't read Lorca at that time. Mm-hmm. And yet there my mother is saying to me, or if indeed every character in the dream is actually the dreamer, I was saying to myself, do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? And I've spent my life answering that.
But living in that wound, in some ways, living in the trauma. Irene asks, what do you do for self-care, given how this writing this book is re-traumatizing yourself when you talk about the pain that you've endured? You know, do family members provide support, given that you have revealed the pain in the family life?
Well, you know, there's a couple of things to think about. On the one hand, when you have a wound like this that doesn't heal, that doesn't go away, you can give it a kind of palliative care. With palliative care, you keep it clean, you expose it to light, you do certain things that can ease the pain sometimes, all in the service of living with it. That is one type of self-care. Being able to tell the story is a kind of self-care. It is palliative. It eases the pain to be able to have a conversation about one of the most shared of human emotions, grief. Also, Percy Bysshe Shelley said two things that are sort of like anthems to me. One, poetry is the mirror that makes beautiful that which is distorted. Even if I'm writing about some of the most traumatic things, when I am creative and making a poem, that is when I'm at my happiest. A poem is generative. It is the greatest act of hope there is. In the face of despair, writing a poem, and even writing this memoir, says, I'm still here. I have survived this, and I can shape it into something beautiful. That is a wonderful feeling. He also said, poems are records of the best and happiest times in the happiest and best minds. So that is another way of thinking about the ways that I care for myself. Even as a little girl, I was caring for myself then by writing, by turning to other art forms. Art heals us. It buoys us. It carries us. It helps us shelter.
Sheltering. It's a good thing in this moment. One question from Ricky. Phenomenal book, he says, or she, I'm sorry, I don't know. Your brother appears in the acknowledgments. How has he fared since the murder, and are you still close?
Yes, we're very close. He still lives in Atlanta, though. And so I've not been able to see him for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, somebody else asked about what kind of poems of yours, if somebody has not yet read this book, are there poems that would help people understand a little better? And one of the ones that I came to mind for me was Letter to Inmate number 271847, Convicted of Murder, 1985. And this is your poem when you found out that Joel Grimet, who eventually did become paroled or released from prison, not at that point though, you did this separation of yourself again. You know, for a moment, I was who I'd been before, the joyful daughter of my young mother. Instead of, again, stepdaughter, daughter of sorrow, daughter of the murdered woman. So now when people introduce you and say, you know, this is Natasha Trethewey, Pulitzer Prize winner, a poet laureate, former poet laureate of the United States, daughter of a murdered woman is going to come through even stronger in some way after this memoir, or people will hear that story. Where does that place you now? Where does that place you after having told this story out loud?
Well, you know, that's one of the reasons I had to write the book, because that backstory was already coming out again and again. I mean, I had several readings that I gave after Native Guard came out, where the person introducing me would say, oh, this book is about three things. It's about her growing up Black and biracial in the Deep South. It's about the Black soldiers that fought for the Union in the Civil War, and her mother's murder. And there that word would be hanging in the air, and I'd have to make my way from my seat up to the podium with that word and the sort of mix of pity and prurient interest that people in the room couldn't help but have. And the more I was written about, the more that backstory became part of it, even though that book wasn't about my mother's murder at all. It was certainly filled with elegies about my loss, but it doesn't say anything about her murder. So for someone to say that, they're only bringing my backstory in. And when my backstory got brought in, my mother was brought along as a footnote or an afterthought as this victim or this murdered woman. And I said, if that's going to keep happening, I'm going to tell her story so that you understand exactly who she is, and that she is in her proper place as the person who made me. That's why I use Shakespeare's sonnet number 3, thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. If you want to know who my mother was, just look at me.
Natasha Trethewey, I thank you so much for your time and for this book. It really is beautiful, and I hope that everybody can enjoy it. You can get a copy of Memorial Drive from Acapella Books. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Virginia.
I'm sorry to those I didn't get to answer specifically your questions. I think some of them got answered in our conversation. We will be playing segments on Second Thought from this interview next Friday, the 14th of August, live at 11, or available anytime after that on the On Second Thought podcast. And we want to thank you so much for joining this special collaboration with Air Serenbe and Atlanta History Center. There are lots more author talks coming up. On Thursday, I'll speak with Grace Elizabeth Hale about Cool Town. That's about Athens, Georgia, how it launched alternative music and changed American culture. And on Monday, August the 10th, New York Times food writer Kim Severson is going to be talking with Lisa Donovan about her new memoir, Our Lady of Perpetual Hunger. Then next Thursday, August 13th, Mab Seacrest joins me to talk about her book, Administrations of Lunacy, Racism and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. Those are just a few of many talks coming up. So there's a full schedule and Zoom links at atlantahistorycenter.com. And as we heard from Natasha Trethewey, stories can save us. They can bring us hope. Well, there are plenty being told right here. And so glad you could join us for this one. Good night.